Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about, actually worrying about, is the uptick in terror that is enveloping Israel. The fear is real. It is justified. The uptick in terror is real. Day-to-day life is peppered with terrorist attacks, and anxiety levels of Israelis rise higher and higher. Of course, it is a natural reaction, a gut reaction. After all, there's terror, but it is not an intifada. The authorities have not labeled it an intifada, and I do not think they will. I do not think that they should. This is nothing like the first intifada, which took place between December 1987 to 1993. That ended with the signing of the Oslo Accords. This is nothing like the second intifada, which has and was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada from September 2000 to 2005. In colloquial terminology, in Arabic, Hebrew, and even in English, intifada means revolt. The common definition understands intifada as a popular uprising predominantly of youth. While the term intifada had been used periodically since the 1950s, it was not a popular word or descriptive term. It did not come tripling off the tongue, not until December of 1987. Now it has become a common word in Arabic, Hebrew, and again, even in English. It was unusual for the word to be heard at all until the Palestinians began using it to define the acts of terror they were perpetrating during the first intifada. The Arabic root of the word is nafada, which means to shake. Actually, to shake off something. It is shaking that, by the way, which is the opposite, opposed to quaking, which somewhat ironically is the meaning of the word charedi, or charad, the root in Hebrew, which means to shake or to quake. Simply put, Palestinians chose to call their action intifada because the message they were sending is that they intended to shake off the opposition and the oppression that Israelis had on them in occupation. The first and second intifada were so different from what is happening today in so many different ways. The intifadas were coordinated through the offices of Yasser Arafat. They were funded, recruited, organized, and strategized by Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership, most notably Marwan Barghouti, who is now languishing in an Israeli prison cell. Arafat funded the intifada as a tool to get the world's attention fixed on his slice of land. He used terror to influence Israel and the world. The first intifada concluded with the framework for peace called the Oslo Accords. Albeit an extremely flawed framework, the Oslo Accords brought about the end of the first intifada. During both intifadas, terror attacks against Israelis appeared to be spontaneous. The riots, the stonings, seemed to be and to emerge. What today we call pop-ups, drive-by shootings, appeared haphazard. But that was just a carefully constructed illusion. They planned and they were tactically arranged. They had specific strategic objectives. Terrorists and rioters were paid. There were organizers. There was a hierarchy. There was accountability to higher officers. And it all began and ended with Yasser Arafat, who would personally stuff cash into envelopes and dole out payments to the people involved. Today's Palestinian leadership does not have the ability to organize any significant network. Today's Palestinian leadership can in no way mimic the organizational structure that Arafat and Barghouti had put in place in the first and second intifadas. What is happening today really is haphazard, not just the illusion it was once made out to be. Many of the attacks are perpetrated by lone wolves, often taking action after having been motivated by ISIS-type websites. And then there are copycats. Today, even if masses of youth agree with the attacks, they're not running out to join the movement of terrorists. They are not signing up to perpetrate other attacks or rushing out to join massive protests. Just like the attacks of yesteryears are not the attacks of today. Palestinian youth of the first and second intifada are not the Palestinian youth of today. There is a full generation and a half difference between the youth of 1987 and the youth of 2022. The youth of today would rather play computer games. Even if the Palestinian leadership closed schools for a day and organized a massive protest, most Palestinian children would stay home and play video games. That's not an assumption. It's been proven. That was exactly what happened when Hamas attempted to rally the youth and rile them up to face Israelis in massive protests in Gaza. Hamas was sadly disappointed by the turnouts because the youth stayed home and played their video games. Abbas and his cadre of Palestinian leadership has not connected with Palestinian youth. Young Palestinians do not believe that Mahmoud Abbas cares about them and their issues. He's disconnected totally from them. Abbas and his minions are totally disconnected from the younger generations. Say and think whatever you want about Marwan Barghouti, but he was loved and admired by Palestinian youth and the working masses. Barghouti was not perceived as part of the hierarchy of the PLO. He never wore a suit, never wore a tie. He acted like, he dressed like any and all Palestinian workers. He looked like the quintessential truck driver. That was the image he cultivated. He led every protest. He stood at the head of every march and marched with them. I've always called Marwan Barghouti an anti-intellectual intellectual. His image was that of a down-to-earth working-class person. But in reality, Barghouti was the brains behind the Intifadas. He was the organizer. Barghouti was so successful that Arafat was jealous of him, so much so that Arafat once pulled his revolver on Barghouti during a meeting. Knowing Arafat all too well, Arafat's bodyguards had earlier removed the bullets from his gun. Abbas is not Arafat, and no one in the PA leadership comes close to resembling Barghouti. Only after Palestinian leadership gains the respect of the youth, only after they appoint a dynamic leader, can there ever be a third Intifada. That does not, however, change today's reality and the frightening uptick in terror that Israel is confronting right now. I've also been thinking about the horrific fire that took place in Gaza and took the lives of a family gathered together for celebration. The fire in which at least 22 people, including at least 7 children, were killed, burned to death when flames erupted and engulfed an apartment in Gaza. The third-floor apartment was situated in Jabalia, a Gaza refugee camp. The family had gathered to celebrate the birthday of one of the children, and then tragedy struck. The fire broke out, and the apartment was quickly consumed by flames. Israel did not set the fire. There was no helicopter raid or drone strike. There was no smart bomb launched from a submarine in the Mediterranean Sea. The cause of the fire, this senseless tragedy, was carelessness. Most probably, it was the result of gasoline or kerosene or gas that was being stored in their apartment. In Gaza, residents store fuel for their kerosene heaters. They store gas for their stoves. They store gasoline for their cars. Fires that burn so quickly and rip through an apartment so thoroughly need accelerants, like the gases. Gaza is controlled by the terror group Hamas. Israel and Egypt have both closed their borders to Gaza. They've been closed for years because Hamas repeatedly dispatched terrorists over those borders to attack Israeli and Egyptian civilians. To this very day, Hamas still regularly attempts to cross the border by land and sea to perpetrate terror attacks. As a result of the border closures, there is an energy shortage in Gaza. Israel, the country Hamas regularly attacks by sea and by land, actually provides significant amounts of electricity for Gazans. Hamas does not pay for the electricity directly. The Palestinian Authority from the West Bank pays Israel. The PA has been defaulting on their payment, leaving Gaza with, on average, only 12 hours of electricity per day. The situation is worsened by Hamas's attacks on Israel. In several instances, Hamas rockets destined for Israel have fallen short. Instead of falling inside Israel, the rockets have actually blown up Israeli electrical stations located in Gaza. These stations are in Gaza to relay and provide significant amounts of electricity for Gaza. First, they erroneously destroyed the electricity stations with rockets that were targeting Israel. Then Hamas leadership demands that Israel Electric Company workers risk their lives and come to Gaza to repair the electric stations. That's chutzpah, I would say. And of course, Hamas will blame Israel for these deaths. There are several very interesting points in this story that must be addressed. Jabalia, the refugee camp, is similar to many other refugee camps. Jabalia is actually a city. Jabalia has many multi-story buildings, especially residences, like the one where the fire broke out, located on the 3rd floor and the top floor of a very new building. The Palestinians call them refugee camps, so that people world over will conjure up an image of people living in tents in camps, cooking over open fires. In reality, these Gazans live in modern apartments. Referencing Jabalia as a refugee camp is a propaganda ploy. Palestinians of Gaza are so convinced of their lie, their narrative is so strong, and for them rings so true, that they continue to tell the lie even in their own coverage of the fire. Hamas media referred to the location of this tragedy as the refugee camp Jabalia. Interestingly, there has been very little coverage in international media about this terrible tragedy. 22 people, at least 7 children killed in Gaza, should be, one would think, news. The dead were all buried together. The 22 bodies were wrapped each in a Palestinian flag, as if they died as martyrs, as if they died for the Palestinian cause. The Israeli press in Hebrew, Arabic, and English covered the story. The Israeli press is carefully monitored by foreign news desks in every major media outlet in the world. So they knew what happened, but they chose not to run with the story. They decided that it was not a significant story. It yielded very little attention. That goes without saying that if Israel had mistakenly shot a missile that resulted in the deaths of 21 people or 22 people, 7 of whom were children, or even the deaths of 15, 10, or 5, it would have been the front pages of every major paper. It would have led every broadcast. It would have been the lead on every news website. This is a prime example of the horrible double standard. The death of Palestinians is only a story if Israel is responsible for the deaths. There are many accidents and malfunctions in Gaza that do not merit international attention. Often terrorists assemble their rockets in their apartments, in their basements, in their garages. Countless innocent deaths have occurred when the bomb makers accidentally blow themselves up or when they misfire. It was calculated that in the previous conflict between Israel and Gaza, about 1/3 of the Palestinians died from mishaps and misfires than from Israeli rockets. Every accidental death is tragic. The death of children and family decimated even more so. A senseless tragedy. Coming up next, points of view. I'm going to talk about one column today. The column is from the New York Times. It was published on November 27, 2022, and is authored by Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel. The column is titled, Opinion Guest Essay, A Goodwill Government Was Possible in Israel. Bennett describes why and how he created his government. He explains the foundations of his government and how, in his government, it was possible to bring together so many different points of view and have them work cohesively. This is how Naftali Bennett begins. A year and a half ago, I made a difficult decision to break from my political base and form a government with people I couldn't have imagined working with in my wildest dreams. Israel was at one of its lowest moments, polarized and paralyzed. 4 rounds of elections in 2 years, massive riots in Arab and mixed towns, and killings of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, plus hundreds of injured. The Palestinian terrorist organization Hamas had just shot rockets into Jerusalem after an annual flag parade in the Old City. The former Prime Minister continues and offers readers the personal side of his story when he tries to recall exactly what happened. I vividly recall the moment, a Sabbath morning when I made the decision. I asked my 4 children to join my wife Gilat and me in the kitchen. I told my family, your Abba is about to attempt something and I don't even know if I'll succeed. A lot of people, including friends, will say a lot of bad stuff about your Abba. So I want you to know that I'm doing this for the sake of Israel. An unrelenting propaganda campaign run by the opposition over social and traditional media tried to break me and my party, Yamina. The pressure worked. Just days before the critical vote, a member of my party bolted. As a result, we were down to the bare minimum necessary to form a new government. On June 13th, 2021, the Knesset voted to establish the new government with a majority of 60, with 59 opposing and with 1 abstention. At that moment, I became the prime minister of the most diverse government in Israel's history. Right and left, religious and secular, Jews and Arabs, all working together. How did I do it? I established a 70-70 rule. About 70% of Israelis agreed on 70% of the issues. We all agreed that we need better trains and roads, better education and more security, and lower cost of living. However, we disagree on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religion and state, and the desired nature of our legal system. So my government focused on the 70% done, as opposed to the endlessly wrangling over the issues we didn't agree on. We all agreed that this government will neither insist on Israeli sovereignty for territories nor hand them over to Palestinians. Similarly, we decided we would not legislate on any disputed religious or legal matters. When you neutralize the most politically sensitive issues, ministers from right and left saw each other as decent people working for the good of Israel and not as demons we've been calling each other. Bennett concludes his column with hope, and the hope is actually a strategy, but it's also a blessing for the future. He writes, "The state of Israel is the 3rd instance of a Jewish political entity in the Holy Land. During the time of the First and Second Temples, we managed to keep our nation together for about 80 years, after which internal divisions tore us apart, and we ultimately lost our independence. Israel is now in its 75th year. This is our 3rd chance, and we are determined that this time we succeed. Though my government operated for only a year, I believe we imprinted a unique image and model of how a highly polarized society can cooperate. That beautiful image, once engraved in hearts and minds, cannot easily be erased." Bennett was correct. He succeeded, but only for 1 year. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 4 cartoons and memes today. The first meme is simply funny. It's about betting on crazy things that just might perhaps happen. We see in the betting background and on the board. On the board are a slew of preposterous items people chose to bet on, like zombies, giant snakes, or reptiles. A man with a pointer asked the room, "Who had Ukraine attacking a NATO member?" That's funny. Totally preposterous, but it happened. Next up is a headline that can only be true. Nobody would make this up. The headline reads, "Philadelphia Dunkin' Donuts robbers spotted stretching beforehand." Well, I suppose you should stretch before doing any strenuous activity, and robbery is certainly a strenuous activity. Donuts are certainly fattening. This next piece is a police announcement in a local paper. Again, nobody could make this up because it is preposterous, but on the other hand, it's true. It reads, October 1st, a group of students playing hide and seek in the Harris Fine Arts Center at 11 p.m. caused a faculty member to call the university police. The police arrived, but were not able to find any students. That is truly hilarious. This last meme is for all of you who fondly remember Willie Nelson and the Muppets. He was on regularly. We see a photo of Willie Nelson surrounded by Muppets, and the caption reads, "Only Willie Nelson could look perfectly normal on this situation." So true. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. I think that Iran is beginning to teeter. The niece of Iran's supreme leader went public and urged the world to cut ties with Tehran because she said Iran is an oppressive regime. Farida Morakhani, a professional engineer, is a well-known human rights activist in Iran. She also was the niece of Iranian supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Her father was a prominent opposition figure in Iran. Her mother is the sister of the Ayatollah. That's real yichus. Following the death of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old Iranian woman who died while in police custody, sparked protests throughout Iran. Morakhani has been calling on foreign governments to cut all ties with Tehran over its violent crackdown on these popular rallies and protests. According to activists, Iranian news agency IRNA, Morakhani was arrested on November 23rd. Since then, a video in which she expresses her feelings about Iranian leadership has been widely shared online.
ای انسان‌های آزاده، در کنار ما باشید و ما را یاری کنید تا دولت‌ها دست از حمایت از این رژیم قاتل و کودک کش بردارند. این رژیم به هیچ اصلی، حتی اصول مذهبی خودش نیز وفادار نیست و جز زر و زور و حفظ قدرت قانون و قاعده‌ای به هر طریق ممکن نمی‌شناسد.
The head of Ukraine's state-run nuclear energy firm is reporting indications that Russian forces might be preparing to leave the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Russia seized the nuclear plant in March, soon after the invasion into Ukraine began. If he's correct, this Russian retreat would be a major Ukrainian victory in the partially occupied southeastern region of Zaporizhzhia. The front line in this area of Ukraine has remained almost unchanged for months, so it's somewhat stable. Repeated shelling around the plant has spurred fears that the nuclear catastrophe could take place. Speaking on national Ukrainian TV, Petro Kotin, the head of Ernagotam, explained his findings this way. He said, "In recent weeks, we're effectively receiving information that signs have appeared that they are possibly preparing to leave the plant. Firstly, there are very large numbers of reports in Russian media that it would be worth vacating the plant and may be worth handing control of it to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. One gets the impression they're packing their bags and stealing everything they can. This could be very good news." A Hamas spokesman announced that the Palestinian issue at the World Cup proves it's in the hearts of millions. Hamas spokesperson Abd al-Latif al-Kuna praised the Arab world's expression of support towards Palestinians at the World Cup in Qatar. He said that, quote, "The presence of the Palestinian issue at the heart of the World Cup proves that this is the main issue of the nation, and it exists in the hearts of millions. This proof of the isolation of the occupying entity over our land," unquote. Palestinian flags have been displayed behind newscasters and carried by fans throughout the games. The Telegraph, a UK-based media outlet, reported that the Taliban earned millions from Qatar in preparing for the World Cup. According to the report, the Taliban received mega money from Qatar for the construction of stadiums and other infrastructure preparations in Qatar for hosting the soccer games. The Telegraph reported that, according to a source in the Taliban's offices in Qatar, the organization sold construction materials and rented equipment to Qatari construction firms and is using the money they received from Qatar to buy more materials and equipment, earning millions in profit. Adidas has launched a probe into misconduct allegations against Kanye West, aka Ye. Adidas AG, which has already cut ties with the musician, fashion designer, and influencer, announced that an investigation is underway into inappropriate behavior that Kanye West has displayed towards their employees. They explained that the probe was initiated after the company received an anonymous letter making several additional allegations against Ye. The investigation comes on the heels of a report by Rolling Stone magazine, which conducted over 24 interviews with former Yeezy and Adidas staff that detailed alleged incidents of inappropriate behavior by West towards staff and towards prospective employees. Israel's IDF chief announced that more joint activity will take place between the U.S. military and Israel. At the conclusion of his visit to the United States, IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi said that in the near future, the joint activity with the United States Military Central Command will be significantly expanded. While in the U.S., Kochavi took part in an assessment in which a roadmap for continuing joint activity and establishing designated troops to deal with the Iranian challenge was agreed upon. Kochavi also met with American security officials in the Pentagon, at the CIA headquarters, and in the White House. The United Nations has announced that they will begin an investigation into Iranian protests against their government and into the regime's violent response to those protesters. The new investigative mission to probe Iran's suppression of mass protests will be set up after passing a vote in the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. The decision to open up this probe was passed by a motion of 25 countries in favor, 6 against, and 16 abstentions. According to those present, activists cheered after the result was read out loud by the Council President, and some diplomats even applauded. Before the vote, Tehran's representative at the meeting, Khalida Karimi, accused Western states of using Human Rights Council to target Iran. She called it appalling and disgraceful. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one picante piece of information. In the very first meme, we saw the term NATO. NATO is an acronym. That means a word which is created from the first letters of the item that it's abbreviating. NATO, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All abbreviations are not acronyms, just the ones that make a word. So USA is not an acronym. It's just 3 initials strung together. SCUBA is an acronym. It's an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So is radar. It stands for radio detection and ranging. You might be surprised to learn, but laser is also an acronym. It stands for light amplification by stimulation emission of radiation. Acronyms are easy in Hebrew because they're all letters. There are no vowels in Hebrew except underneath. Any and all Hebrew letters can be put together to make a word and pronounced with ease. So Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Where are the vowels? They are the dots and dashes underneath the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.